I think ACDC filled that void in Australian rock suburbia that was so needed at the time.
High Voltage was just raw, timeless, basic rock and roll, and it didn't need you know, glitter or stack heels, and it still stands up fantastically well, you know, even as the band was still embryonic. You can actually see the joins in that record, the way they're starting to figure out how to write songs with Bon Scott. This is the thing, Bon had come in and he's got his little notebooks and he's got ideas, he's got narrative stories. There's even the sort of a bit of a suggestion that he'd started to write in the latter fraternity days, but because that was much more of an intellectual kind of band, that, you know, his songs weren't going to work for them. But so Bon came into the band with, if not ideas, he had the real urge to express himself, and he's just a master wordsmith. So, you know, Malcolm and Angus get this guy who's going to give them this focus to work around and shape things. And then you got George. This is the whole thing. George wasn't going to polish a turd, but he was always going to be able to give it the dynamic shape, you know, just help the band shape songs, make sure it's got the crunch in it, and just get that down. He didn't have to make slick records. That was anathema. They wanted to make dirty, raw records. So doing it in sessions between live gigs over 10 days sort of makes sense too. You know, that's how most Australian bands made records in those days.
ACDC were off the starting blocks. They soon changed their lineup again, recruiting Phil Rudd on drums and Mark Evans on bass. As a band, they became more honed, and on stage their performance was electric. Bon in particular was developing into an iconic performer, and his true character was showing through at last.
Bon Scott was the first rock and roll non-sex symbol. That's what he was. He had a hairy chest, he had a beer gut, he had really bad hair, you know, completely unattractive. But there was something so lovable about him. You know, he was that lovable rogue, and you couldn't help but fall in love with him if you were female, and probably want to have a beer with him if you were male.
To me, he was more of a musical performer than he was a rock and roll performer, because he had that ability to act the words, act the lyrics, but without acting. He was probably closer to people like Max Wall in a way than he was to Mick Jagger, because he had that certain element about him that made him not just a strutting rock and roller, but a real character actor. He got into the part on stage of being Bon Scott. It was an extension of what he was and what he is, and he couldn't be anything else apart from Bon Scott, but he accentuated it brilliantly, so that you knew that what you were seeing on stage was the real thing, but you also knew that it was the real thing magnified to the nth degree. And there are very few people who can pull that trick off to an extent that everybody accepts it.
Angus, meanwhile, was coming into his own, sharing the limelight with Bon and blowing audiences away through his electric performances.
I suspect a lot of it had to do with nerves. He was so young when they started. He didn't know what the hell to do, and he'd probably been told by his older brothers, you get out there and do something. So he just started doing that. That's pretty much, I'm sure, how it really did develop, because he didn't know what else to do. He'd never, he was too young. He loved Chuck Berry, so he knew the duck walk, so he'll take a bit of that and he'll run around a bit, he'd bang his head, and it goes down a storm. So it's like, well, we'll keep on doing this then.
It's difficult to quantify what Angus is about and where Angus stands in the whole gamut of ACDC, the whole mythology of ACDC. To me, Bon in the 1970s was the heart of ACDC. Angus was its soul. There's something about Angus that makes you feel he is so important in the whole style and philosophy of DC that they, to put it in a modern perspective, could lose Brian Johnson. They lost Malcolm Young for a while, but losing Angus will be the end. They could not replace Angus because he is the soul of that band. I don't think Angus himself realises it. I don't think he understands why he's so revered and loved by AC/DC fans. He knows they do, and he just gets on with what he does. But it's that something about him is that the spirituality he has in the way he plays his music. And I'm not talking about a religious spirituality, I'm talking about the way he connects with his music. And a lot of that, I still believe, has to do with the way that Bon Scott brought him out of his shell, the way that Bon Scott made him part of what ACDC are all about, and a very crucial and important part. I think Bon gave him confidence.
No one was prepared for ACDC's next album. TNT exploded into the charts at the end of 1975 and sold over 100,000 copies in Australia. Few could doubt that on record, the band had finally arrived.
TNT was really their first proper album. It was the first album we thought, you know what, the sound's there. Tracks like TNT are just still wonderful. You listen to them and they've still got that drive, that emotion. They're fantastic tracks. And this was the moment ACDC were born internationally, because people started to sit up and say, have you heard that band ACDC? Have you heard this album? It's great. It's got a great groove to it. It had a little bit of elements of the Quo or the Stones or even the Faces as far as British fans were concerned. It also had a certain, dare one say, punk attitude before punk actually had even been invented. DC were very much of the street, and they had a great groove, a great rhythm, and this was the album that really first brought it to the fore. And I think it made everybody sit up and think, good grief, what an improvement. Real album here.
With TNT, the band had realised their potential. Yet domestic success was not the end of the rainbow for ACDC. The following year, the band would step into unknown territory and leave the sunny shores of their homeland behind. On signing an important deal with Atlantic Records in Britain, ACDC decided it was time to conquer new territories, and in March 1976 moved to London to begin the next phase of their master plan.
Now, with the confidence of topping the charts in Australia now, and the success that this gradual follow-up that's happened, and now it's become a monster in Australia, are you going overconfident that you can take on an English market?
Yeah, well, we are confident.
Yeah.
We're not overconfident, but we are very confident.
AC/DC came to London and came to England with a confidence that they would break the UK. They had no doubts about it, absolutely no doubts. And I saw their first gig at the Red Cow in Hammersmith in '76. And there was a little bit of a buzz about this band who'd come over from Australia. People had heard TNT, bought TNT, an import in fact. And there was a little bit of a buzz going about this band who'd come over and were over here now and were going to tour and really make it. And when they came on stage for that first show at the Red Cow, there weren't very many people there. But they just came on with a sort of, you know what, this is the birth of a legend. We're prepared to play for you lot like you're 50,000 people, because we know one day it will be, as indeed it has been. So from day one, they didn't have the problem. They'd done it before. They knew they could do it. And they also had so much confidence in themselves, not overconfidence, confidence, and immediately made an impact. As soon as they appeared on stage, that was it. The buzz grew.
The music scene in Britain at the time was on the brink of the punk rock explosion, and ACDC unwittingly found themselves being bracketed with the likes of Johnny Rotten.
When ACDC arrived in the UK, that was just the dawn of the Sex Pistols and all that sort of stuff. So they were kind of a bit confused with that, you know, in the marketplace. But I think the thing was ACDC were traditionally hard-playing band, which couldn't be said for lots of the punk bands, that's for sure. So, you know, they could clean the floor with them in terms of, you know, rocking out. They just left people, you know, speechless, really.
Like we honestly thought that the punk and the new wave thing might sort of spoil a bit for us, but it hasn't at all, you know?
Yeah.
It was a big fad, like it's just like anything else, big fad for a while, and there's those that are still hanging on to it. But the main thing about it is that it gives rock music a real kick in the guts, you know?
Yeah.
And we sort of, even though we started the whole thing over here, like we played here before the Sex Pistols were even sort of, you know, thought of.
Yeah.
And now we've always been there, and people are beginning to realise that now they want more than just someone up there screaming, you know, anarchy and rape and this sort of, you know, crap, you know. And we're it. Yeah. We're doing it right.
In May, ACDC released their first official UK album, the British High Voltage, an amalgam of their previous two Australian LPs. They quickly gained the support of the British music press and did a 20-date tour supported by Sounds magazine. In August, they toured Europe with Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow before releasing a new album in Australia, Dirty Deeds done dirt cheap.
Dirty Deeds was the most honed record they'd made to date. You know, they were starting to get on top of, you know, really making records, and so, you know, deservedly so, it was the most honed record they'd made to that time, and it contains some absolute classics. I've always contended that most of their albums are a bit bitsy. Most groups have a bit bitsy, but if you get 3 or 4 or 5 great tracks, you're really on